tell you things you've never heard before. Not only that, in front of the mayor. Pressure, serious pressure. Thanks so much. This is the first time I've spoken here, and I've driven by a number of times, and I've never been in the building. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Jeff for the kind invitation to join you this evening, and a terrific turnout. And really what I'm going to do is something a little bit different from some of the previous speaker series lectures I've given. I'm going to introduce a project that we've been working on somewhat quietly at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and share with you some of that work that we've been building. And I think the best place to start is perhaps with a confession. I'm not from Florida. I know. And I should never do that because I get booed. I didn't grow up in Florida. I grew up in Western Canada. And I know more boos. Thank you. This is such a warm crowd. And if you had told me as a graduate student you're going to have a career as a 16th century Spanish Florida scholar, I would have said, why? And to illustrate that point somewhat, I only started to work in earnest on early colonial Florida subjects about 13, 14 years ago. And when I decided to do that, I spoke with a colleague and I said, you know what, I'm going to work on 16th century Florida. And there was a long pause on the other end of the phone, and his response was, what will you do after you finish reading both documents? And I thought, first of all, that's irritating. And secondly, I'm going to prove him wrong. And when I teach my early Florida class, I always start with this image. What you see, all of these teal circles, these dots scattered around the present-day state of Florida, all of those dots represent a pre-Columbian archaeological site registered in the Florida Master Site File. About 25,000, in excess of 25,000 pre-Columbian archaeological sites just within the state of Florida. When you look at the colonial period, that number now, this is a number from what they had registered in 2015. It's probably closer to 700 colonial era. In other words, that period bound between Juan Ponce de Leon's arrival in 1513 and 1821. So you see, again, and as more archaeological work is done, more sites will be registered. And part of what this project is that we launched last year was an attempt to not only share, but convey this incredibly rich early history through a digital format. A strategy that is not another monograph or another article about this period. So in March of 2018, we launched a site called La Florida, the Interactive Digital Archive of the Americas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the elements from this particular site. The project really began in 2012. In 2012, we received permission from the Bishop of St. Augustine to digitize the parish records from St. Augustine's archive. These are the oldest written documents. You have to follow the logic here because it's always tricky when you have oldest because most oldest are not oldest. These carry the oldest written documents housed in the United States about any region in the United States. In other words, the documents at this archive predate any documents from the National Archives about the U.S. They go back to 1594. This is pre-Jamestown stuff. And the archive is organized rather loosely in baptisms, marriages, confirmation, and death records. And some of those records look like this. So when I spoke with the bishop, I said, we have to do something to preserve these. Because, and I mentioned to him, I promise you, if these were documents about New England, Virginia, Texas, California, they not only would have been restored, but they would have been accessible to everybody to look at these records. And I said, you have this incredible collection. Our first step is to preserve it. We need to digitize it. Nobody should be touching these. And in the 20s, when they tried to preserve these records, what they did, the best strategy of the day, was to shrink wrap them. So that's what's happened to them. And they're slowly going to be destroyed from this process. So we wanted to digitize the records and make those records available to anybody with internet access. And we did. So all of these records are on the site. But let me ask you this. What does a 5th or 4th grade Florida history teacher do with this? What does a student do with this? College, what does anybody do with this without specialized training in how to decipher 16th, 17th century Spanish script? And so, over a decade ago, I started a program when I taught at the University of North Florida. I now teach this program at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, to teach students how to read 16th century Spanish handwriting. Oh, you know, I know. You heard Governor DeSantis earlier today announce that this was going to be a requirement for all Florida students. I have this recurring dream. I had it when it was Governor Scott, that I woke up and I hear on the radio, Spanish paleography is now a critical skill for Florida students. When I teach this class, a handful of students, I have one veteran in the back of the room whom I will introduce later. Students come in to take this class. I explain it's not paleontology, some leave, and then the rest sit down and look rather nervous about this class. I dim the lights, lock the door, and then I show this document. And what this is from the parish records, from a 17th century book of baptisms. Somebody wrote these 2 lines on the first page. And when I first saw it, the first word that jumped out at me was this word here, diablo. Devil. I thought, why is somebody writing devil on the first page of a book of baptisms? And the handwriting, somebody else drew on it, 1640 question mark. The handwriting is 18th century. And what this 18th century, likely the priest, wrote on this 17th century book of baptisms was the following. My dear Lord, not even the devil could read this. The writing is so bad, I can't make out a single word in it. And so I tell the students, stick with me for 8 months and you will learn a skill that the devil himself does not possess. And then they get excited. They go, okay, I'm in here for 8 months. And so out of those programs, the digitization and working with students on original documents, we launched this interactive digital archive of the Americas. And the site is divided really into 5 sections. And I'm going to emphasize really a couple of these different sections. I can feel the excitement build when you see prosopography. Oh, good! Finally, we get a speaker who will talk to us about prosopography. We've been begging for this for years. One of our tech gurus, our Chief Innovation Officer, is here in the back, who flew from Spain for this talk. And he saw this, he said, we're not calling it prosopography. Nobody will know what that is, we're going to call it people. And I said, okay, so it's about people. Prosopography, very simply, is the study of collective biography. Looking at groups of people and drawing conclusions about characters, individuals, what we can say about groups of individuals. And on the site now, we have about 4,000, just over 4,000 people who lived in Florida at some point between 1513 and 1821. And we barely scratched the surface. We are going to build the largest interactive biographical database for any region of the United States. It's already getting close to that on the site already. And it really began for me with some very simple questions that students often ask in class. Namely, who were these people we call the conquistadors? We call them conquistadors. Every textbook calls them conquistadors. But who were they? How old was the average conquistador? What do we know about their level of education, where they were from, single or married? What kinds of occupations did they fill? We have this image of military characters. Angry, the quintessential conquistador look. The conquistadors never smile. They don't look like settlers, in other words. They don't have nice hats and shiny shoes and buckles. They're military characters. And what I wanted to do was get a sense from the early Spanish expeditions into Florida. Who were the people who came with Ponce de Leon, or Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, or Pánfilo de Narváez, Hernando de Soto, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, who founded St. Augustine. So I started to build a database of everybody I could find in the documents, in the primary sources, to get a better sense of who these characters were. And part of that mission, I think, was accelerated when you look at after St. Augustine was established in 1565. Pedro Menéndez de Avilés had a contract with the King of Spain, King Philip II, to establish 3 towns. That was in his contract. You have to establish 3 towns while you're in Florida. This is what he does in the first 3 years. You have Spanish garrisons up from the Tampa Bay area down to basically the deepest ports in the Gulf, near present-day Miami, Santa Lucia, St. Augustine, present-day Jacksonville, Cumberland Island, Georgia, a place called Santa Elena. You might know it better by its present name, which is Parris Island, South Carolina. And on Parris Island, thanks to the Marines, that archaeological site basically was saved because the Marines built a golf course on it. It was brilliant. I mean, I will forever love anyone who has ever served in the Marines for saving one of the most important archaeological sites in broader La Florida. Because Florida, of course, as you remember, the Spanish referred to this entire region as the provinces of Florida. Florida extended all the way up the Atlantic seaboard and all the way into the interior to some mysterious place that eventually would connect with what they saw as New Spain. So, if you're from Virginia, congratulations, you really are an early Floridian. And so the garrison at Parris Island, and then in 1566, 67, and 68, there were Spanish garrisons as far into the interior as the Tennessee Valley. Now, of course, the only one of those sites that survived the 16th century was St. Augustine. All of the others had various time of duration. Santa Elena, Parris Island was the second longest lasting, but it didn't. It survived only 21 years. And I was really interested in who were the people who were there. Who went there? Who were the people who settled in early St. Augustine? And part of that was, I think, part of the excitement was when we found the list of occupations of people that Pedro Menéndez de Avilés took with him to Florida in 1565. 21 tailors, 15 carpenters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, a couple of rope makers, coopers, a master tile maker, a sawyer, a baker, 4 priests, an apothecary, a few swordsmiths, 1 hat maker. Yeah, well, that's a great job, the hat maker. 1 trumpeter. He must have been extraordinarily popular as well. 117 laborers, 5 barbers. Remember, in the 16th century, barbers also performed minor surgery. This was, barber wasn't somebody who just gave you a nice shave and a haircut. And then my personal favorite, this individual, un maestre de hacer cerveza. A master beer brewer. When you think about that list and you reflect on those occupations, those are people that every single textbook, without exception, call conquistadors. These are the conquistadors. Does that quite capture the makeup of these early expeditions? So what we wanted to find out is, do other expeditions look like this? Do they look different? How can we compare these and move away from this very simple characterization of the people who arrived before the English eventually come to Jamestown. And we really started with an expedition that, again, I know you're terribly excited because most of you are intimately familiar with Sancho de Archiniega. I get this is the same response in Spain. I think only if you go to his hometown in Portugalete, which is just outside of Bilbao, most Spaniards have never heard of Sancho de Archiniega. Sancho de Archiniega led the single largest European expedition to Florida during the entire colonial period. And yet, nobody knows his name. He didn't stay long, and that might be one of the reasons. He dropped people off. This was an expedition with more than 2,300 individuals. 18 ships, 16 of them arrived unscathed in St. Augustine in the early summer of 1566. It's really a stunning expedition in many ways. And we've spent the last 3 years trying to piece together this expedition. I think you're getting a wonderful window into my social life as we're trying to piece together all of these individuals. And so we've identified 2,325 so far. We have places of origin for almost 90% of them. At present, we have 286 non-Spaniards on this expedition. Now, that number should be closer to 400 because there were a lot of individuals, especially mariners, who were not Spanish. And unless we know where they're from, we don't put it in. We're very cautious about this kind of information. But I promise you, Johann van Copenhagen was not a Spaniard. And so there are others with names like that you know, okay, they're not Spaniards, but we don't know exactly where they're from. This number will likely, over the years, I think, increase to by at least another 100, 150 individuals. But if you showed a map, this is one of the things the site will be able to do, and students and others can generate infographics to say, show me the breakdown within Spain of where these people came from. And what was so stunning when we ran the data is that people on this expedition came from every single region of Spain without exception. Without exception, from Catalonia, from the Balearic Islands, from Murcia, Valencia. We have identified 57 different occupations, 21 musicians, priests. We have literacy rates roughly established for almost a third of which is stunning. We don't have this literacy rate for any other Spanish expedition to any other part of the Americas in the 16th century. And we know that there were 273, so already well over 10% of the people who went on that expedition were roughly literate. Literacy is very difficult to gauge, but this group here was a group that they had an advanced literacy that meant more than just being able to sign their name. And some of them were perfectly fluent. It's a difficult thing to track. But already the profile, you read in so many textbooks, the people who went to Florida were the dregs of society. Nobody wanted to come to Florida, they're uneducated conquistador types. And this kind of data began to challenge some of those broader assumptions about it. This feature was quite stunning when we realized, when we ran all the information about places of residence, they came from more than 700 different cities, towns, villages, hamlets, scattered throughout Spain and these regions. So a 5th grade textbook or 4th grade textbook that highlighted in a map where did people from the Sancho de Archiniega expedition, where did they come from? And this is what it would look like. So we have North Africans. This past summer, we found 5 people from present-day Dubrovnik, Croatia. 1 Pole, a lot of Portuguese, some Germans, Greeks, Italians, Norwegians, obviously a lot of Flemish individuals. And this individual here from Florida was actually a Native American chief. He was a cacique from Florida. We don't know yet how he got to Spain or when he arrived in Spain. But he went on this expedition likely to serve as a guide and a translator. And all we know right now is his name and that he was a chief. And the goal is eventually to piece together some more of that information. Ages for the people who went on the expedition. We have right now almost 500 ages identified. Most of the people who stayed actually fall in this group here. In other words, most of the early Spanish and other settlers of Florida are my students. Sometimes I say, oh dear, they're my students. Sometimes I say, okay. But most of them are in their early 20s. This age group here, you know, getting into their 50s, late 40s, most of those individuals were mariners. And so they distort, those numbers distort the average ages a little bit. This number is going to come down. If you only looked at people who stayed in Florida, it would be younger than that. We have for this expedition what people ate on the 79-day voyage every single day for every single meal.
Oh, wow.
So imagine then as somebody who teaches about health on transatlantic voyages and starts to compare what people ate on Spanish vessels versus French or English. This was the ration each month for vinegar and olive oil. And so we couldn't put the amount of sea biscuit, hardtack, because boy did they eat a lot of hardtack. This was something that I'm sure after a while people said, you show me another piece of hardtack, I'm going to throw you over this ship. But this is what they ate on Sundays and Thursdays, and we basically, my wife said, I want to plate this and give a rough estimate of the size of each dish. But Tuesday was bacon and cheese day on these vessels, and then wine. Does that look like a lot of wine?
No.
Does it now? 1 quart of pure wine per person per day. And last summer I found the criminal records from this expedition. Most of the crimes happened over wine rations that somebody had put vinegar or water in somebody's wine ration, or wine was consumed and gambling started. And then that's when the knives come out and somebody gets stabbed in the face. And so all of those crimes were reported. It also included the mortality rate on this expedition. When you think about the Middle Passage and the transportation of African slaves to the Americas, the mortality rate on the Middle Passage, on average, was 50%. I mean, it's staggering when you think of the numbers of slaves that arrived in the Americas. 50% died on the voyage. And on this expedition, the mortality rate, 17 ships left. 1 ship was damaged, so it had to stay in Puerto Rico. But 8 of the 17 ships, 7 deaths. It's better than a Carnival cruise, no? I shouldn't say that. I hope nobody works for Carnival. I didn't mean it could be any contemporary cruise. And then garlic usually went to the elite. They could put garlic in their food. We have about 400 physical descriptions of people from the 16th century. We have no art or portraits of anyone who lived in Florida in that early colonial period. But we have physical descriptions of people like Pedro de Alenda. It must have been nice. You're tall, dark, and handsome, with 2 scars on his face and forehead. And then Antonio Garcia follows, oh, tall, dark, and handsome. Nope, you're round and fat with a big nose. These were the licenses of the day. This is how you proved who you were. And you had to get a license to go on these expeditions. So when you got your license, they recorded distinguishing features. Has a big dog bite mark on his right leg. Has, missing all of his teeth. Pock marks, those sorts of things. These are the licenses. And not surprisingly, people sold these licenses at the local pub. So somebody could go in, Pedro could see somebody and say, oh, you're pretty tall and dark, maybe not as handsome as I am. You're missing the scars, so drink up, this is going to hurt, but you could be me. And so he could sell his license, and I think we have 5 people on that expedition who went to Florida as people they were not. And so we're tracking all of this kind of information. Obviously, Francisco Martin would have had a terrible time selling his license. He had one eye with a scar next to his left eye from a knife wound. We thought we would find more people with pockmarks. I think we have about 5. And I think 4 of those 5 came from the Canary Islands, which, again, raises some interesting opportunities for future research about disease and disease transmission. And so our tech team, what we didn't want to do is give people the impression that we're showing exact portraits of people, because we don't know what they look like. So our tech gurus said, well, we can kind of animate them in ways that they look like caricatures in some ways, and we can build character profiles. So when you go to the site, you'll be able to search by occupation, names. For those that have physical descriptions, they will be in there. So where are we going now with this? Well, a month and a half ago, I guess, we received a grant from the Lastinger Foundation out of Northeast Florida to take the 9,000 pages of parish records and translate and transcribe every single page. So we are going to put all of the parish records on this site in English and Spanish. Some of the entries are in Latin, so that users can use that information. And we're going to create a digital exhibit dividing the records. Basically, the idea is you'll enter into the site, and it will be like you're entering into an early colonial church. And you can go in, and then with the filters on the side, you can say, I want to see every time this name appears, or I want to know all of the people from this particular town. All of that information will then be searchable, and users then can find baptism, marriage, confirmation, death records for anyone that they're interested in locating. So we've recently hired a couple of people to work with us on this project. We'll have all of this stuff finished, I hope, in less than 2 years. We budgeted that it will take us about 2 years to do all of the transcriptions and translations. But basically, it will be like you're looking at a book, and you can filter and flip through pages, and it will be, the idea is to give users an archival experience without having to go to the archive. And all of that stuff is readily available and searchable. Many of the pages now, we have about 30 on the site so far, where you can simply scroll over the 16th century words and the word appears above it. Wow. And our Chief Innovation Officer said that they are currently working on a program that will recognize the words. Now, I'm a 16th century person and a devoted Luddite. And I said, I don't think you can do that. And he said, oh, he gives me the Spanish equivalent to bless your heart. Bless your heart, watch us. So it's this ongoing challenge. In any case, the idea is that people will be able to access material that until now is only accessible to a very select few who have specialized training in how to read these kinds of documents. And so the next exhibit is an exhibit we're calling Free and Enslaved. It's all about the role of Africans. And part of this was, from my perspective, influenced by the fact that the federal government last year established a commission to commemorate the arrival of the first recorded slave in the United States. Any idea what date that was? 1619. First group of slaves arrived in Virginia. So we're going to commemorate the 400-year anniversary of the arrival of the first recorded slave. I wrote to them. Nobody responds because I think they think it's another crazy historian responding. They're only off by 106 years. The first recorded person of African descent to arrive in Florida arrived with Ponce de Leon as a free black conquistador in 1513. His name was Juan Garrido. Juan Garrido later joined Hernando Cortez's expedition into Mexico, and he was one of 2 free black conquistadors on Ponce de Leon's expedition. Between 1513 and 1619, hundreds of shipwreck survivors, slaves and free blacks, arrived in Florida before 1619. And so we're building a profile of all of the people of African descent who arrived in Florida between those periods. This is Juan Garrido's what's called a proof of merit petition. This was a petition he submitted to the Crown to ask for benefits for his services in the conquest of Mexico and in Florida. And in it he says he was the first person to introduce wheat into Mexico. You wouldn't hear that, I don't think, in Mexico City. Juan Garrido introduced wheat in Mexico. In the parish records, we have the first recorded baptism of anyone of African descent. Here are some of the treasury records we've been working with, badly damaged in a fire. But this treasury record refers to a slave named Domingo and a little black girl named Catalina. It dates to the late 1590s. Both Domingo and Catalina had contracted the plague. And what this inventory lists is the medical treatment used by the physician to treat the plague. And the medical treatment, in fact, included loquats. Loquats aren't from Florida. And so we're still unsure. What are they referring to? Is it some fruit from Mexico? Is it something local that maybe looks like a loquat? But it was loquats that they said they were using as part of the treatment against the plague. And this record here is, as far as we know now, this is the oldest marriage record in the United States. It dates to 1565. It's a marriage between a Spanish soldier named Miguel Rodriguez, who was from Segovia, and a woman named Luisa de Abrego, who was a free black woman from Seville, Spain. So the oldest marriage record in the United States is an interracial marriage, the oldest continent record we have. This isn't in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So many things about Florida are not part of a broader national knowledge. So we've made a few videos on this site. You can go to the site and watch. Right now we have 3 short videos. One of them is about the Luisa de Abrego story. The marriage doesn't end well. But you have to go to the site to see what happens with this marriage. She basically denounces herself as a bigamist. And so the story documents this marriage, which is quite fascinating. And so you can watch these videos. We'll be tracking through an interactive all of the runaway slaves that tried to make it to Florida, starting really in the early 1680s, running through the middle of the 18th century. The parish records track where they came from. And so we'll be able to track visually where these, when and where, and the ethnic makeup of those who escaped to try to come to Spanish Florida. In other words, part of that, really that earlier underground railroad that ran south into Spanish Florida, not north. And we have a remarkable repository of documents that talk about this, as well as an interactive map that shows the ethnic breakdown of where they came from. So this will be part of a history, a chapter in U.S. history that is not particularly well known, and not just in Florida, but elsewhere in the United States. And I think that was perhaps best highlighted. I had to review a textbook last year, or a year and a half ago, for AP History. It was a national textbook. I won't say where it was published, but it ends in Massachusetts. But the section on Florida was only a couple of paragraphs. Every single sentence was factually incorrect. It wasn't a matter of interpretation. You can understand that. But it was factually incorrect. So I said, well, everything's wrong. I mean, it's factually incorrect. Yeah, well, thanks for your report. It doesn't matter that much, and it's such a small section of the book. So we're going to leave it as is. And so the last one, in thinking about closer to the Tampa Bay area, we've launched a 2-year project about the Hernando de Soto expedition. And I wanted to show you, many of you seen this map, 18th century map of Tampa Bay?
No.
It's oriented a little odd. The orientation is slightly, you have to turn it the other way. This is moving north.
Okay.
Here.
Okay.
Right? You see that? And And so we're animating this map, creating a unique animation. If you go to the site on April the 24th, that animation will be on the site. And you'll be able to have this, there'll be this interactive experience with this particular map. But we wanted to chronicle, this is what it looks like if you turn the orientation around slightly. So, we wanted to chronicle something about the Soto expedition because there's a tremendous amount of material that has not been published about the Soto expedition. And so this letter here, for example, this is a letter that Hernando de Soto dictated in the Tampa Bay area in 1539. This is the oldest document written in Florida that we have. Was this letter that he didn't write it, he dictated, he was not to write, the scribe wrote, and he dictated this letter, and you see here the scribe's signature. But we started to work with the licenses for these individuals. There are about 800 people who received licenses to go on this expedition. This is just one of those licenses. It's a license of another one of the free black conquistadors. There were 5 of them so far of the 500 that we found, who had to present his papers to say that he was not a slave, and he joined the expedition as one of the conquistadors on the expedition. And when you compare this, you look at the profile of where the Spaniards came from on this expedition, it's completely different from the Sancho de Archiniega expedition. In other words, almost half of them came from Extremadura. So far, of the 504 we have in the list, nobody from the Kingdom of Aragon. And that's not surprising. That's what it should look like. This is what made Archiniega look a little different. But the dominance of Extremadura is unusual. And even within Extremadura, the dominance in one province, the southern province of Badajoz, is quite striking. That's where most of the people came from. And we want to do this with all of the expeditions. And then we're going to use this map by way of coming close to getting to a conclusion. This is a map that was developed right after the survivors of the Soto expedition reached Mexico. About 300 people survived that expedition. This is the only 16th century map that I've ever seen that plots Native American settlements. There are dozens of them. None in Florida. They didn't stay in Florida for very long, and the map maker, no, we don't plot any in Florida. But outside, there are a whole range of Native American towns. The idea on the site is that this is going to be essentially the cap of an interactive experience that is layered. And we'll be able to add content, images, video throughout this. So right now, if you go to the site, you'll be able to scroll your mouse over all of these towns and see names of places. Like Bahia Honda, this is what the Spanish called Tampa Bay. Or you can go to this site here, Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa was a chiefdom in the 16th century, a powerful chiefdom in the 16th century. And if you just put this map on a website, few users would be able to now see what everything said. We wanted to present all of that information. Or the text that's hidden in the corner that says, Desde Quivira hasta aquí a grandísimas manadas de vacas. From Quivira in present-day New Mexico to here, there are great herds of cattle. Well, herds of cattle in 1544 here, and of course this is what they're talking about. And for the Spanish, they do the same thing Native Americans do when they see in linguistic exchanges, the first exchanges are with nouns. And the Spaniards looked at this animal and said, it's a hairy cow. And that's what they called it. Many parts of the Americas, natives looked at the horse and said, it's a deer from Castile. It's like a deer, but it's not like our deer. It's a Castilian deer. They ride them, and they're fantastic. Spanish said the same thing. They're hairy, they're delicious, and they like the pelts, and so, but it was a cow for them. They didn't call it a buffalo or a bison. And so we wanted to use this map as a tool for people who aren't going to pick up 600-700 pages of Soto text and read through it. but rather interact with this map about episodes of violence and episodes of the local economy where people grew maize and other things that appear in the documents. We're going to embed this in the map itself with video content. And the goal, if we hope, is that we will never again get a national textbook that looks at Florida history as a meaningless chapter in the rest of U.S. history. And I think that's something that I think if Florida can be framed within that much broader national and global story, which it is, I think students and people who live here and visit will have an entirely new appreciation for the richness that this poor Western Canadian had no idea late in life. So on that note, I thank you, and I'm happy to entertain questions, or if you're starving. And before, I just want to introduce Rachel Sanderson, who's the Associate Director of the La Florida Project, and Francisco Guitar from Malaga, Spain, who makes all the technology happen.
I can't tell you how cool this is. I'm sure everybody is thinking the same thing. Holy cow!
Holy buffalo!
Hairy cow, sorry. This was so interesting, and it certainly, I'm sure, it piques my interest to go on there and learn more about what Florida had. But that's huge surprises, too.
Yeah.
I mean, holy cow, who knew that your career would continue like this?
I know.
Besides being up here for 2 years, you said 2 years for a couple things to finish up, but I mean, this is an ongoing project.
Yeah, we get the question a lot. So what's the end of this?
Yeah.
And we had a long discussion at the beginning. We said, you realize we're building a project that has no end.
Right.
It's like Seinfeld. You know, there's no story to it. It is and we did that with reason. We said we don't want a project that has a definite end because people constantly find new stuff. And we wanted to create something dynamic that as that new material is found, it can be easily incorporated into digital format. And that was the goal. At the same time, we didn't have a target audience. We did everything wrong, basically. People said, you have to have a target audience. And we said, we don't want a target audience. Our target audience is everybody. We didn't want it just for 4th grade students or 5th grade or high school or professional scholars. We said we want to build a site that brings everyone who should have an interest in the past in general and should find something of interest. If it's just an interesting video, great. But if somebody wants to dig, go into Alice's Wonderland and enter into the rabbit hole, we want to create rabbit holes. We want people to go deep, 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 and beg to go deeper into those rabbit holes. So that was the philosophical underpinning of
Do
it.
you grade your students that you I think it's a good class to take.
So the Soto class, I'm teaching a class, kind of an overload of, just called Finding Soto. So I have one student working on a fascinating project to take all of the known sources, and he's going to plot on this map every episode of military violence, military encounter between Native Americans and Soto. And then we'll be able to filter that on the side of the site based on source. And the whole idea is to make this map come to life. And they seem, I don't know, maybe they're just pretending, but they seem to be, because they're doing research. And so teaching students how to read the paleography was critical for me because I don't think students should be reading the translations. I think work with the original documents when you can.
It's very interesting.
Yes, sir.
When I was going to USF back many years ago, I had a professor. And
Charles Arnade.
Probably, yeah. I don't know. He took 2 years off, took a sabbatical, went to Spain.
That's exactly who it was.
If that's who it was. Most interesting professor I ever had, and he's what got me really interested into this stuff. And I am glad that there is someone now yourself, that has taken up the torch again and has gone through and is doing this kind of work. This is the kind of stuff like when I used to talk to my students and say, yeah, you know what you just read in that book? Yeah, that's not right. You know, and we need this. And I think it's fantastic what you are doing.
Well, that's a humbling because Charles Arnade's shoes are enormous shoes for anyone to fill. He's really one of the pioneers in Florida, Spanish Florida history, and I never had a chance to meet him. You know,
I bet his ear all the time.
Yeah.
What's the cutoff of your site going to be as far as
date? 1821.
So you will go to revolutionary Florida and go
Correct.
to Mexico.
Correct. So what we'd like to do as we build and we raise some more funds, what I want to do is contract the best scholars in American Revolution period. It's too much for one or two people to do. So you contract those people to do the prosopography of Florida during the Revolution, to do stuff about the economy, and add to the site. In a sense, offer grants to scholars. Scholars usually work pretty well if there's a grant involved. We'll give you a travel grant to go to an archive to go to Kew or something in England. And so that would be the goal. We're going to produce a video this summer on the Adams Onis tree. So we'll have a short 3 to 4 minute animated video about Florida around really 1819 to 1821. But that's the weakest part of the site right now because we started with the early stuff. We have the list of all of the people in St. Augustine who evacuated when the British took over in 1763-64. So of all the entire evacuation list, St. Augustine was abandoned. There was nobody. 3 families stayed. It was a ghost town, and almost all of them went to Cuba. We have all those folks.
If you would like, I mean, you're welcome to take more questions.
And my students leave during, so if you have to go, it doesn't bother. I'm not offended if you say, oh, I don't want to get
We'll
up.
take a couple more questions, and
throw
then
something
don't
out.
forget we're going to break for
I have one
refreshments.
question. Do you teach your class about the writing online? Or
I do not yet. I get this question a lot.
Okay.
I have a little bit of funding so that I can take the students who the students who do well in that class. I take them to Spain in the summer for 8 weeks, and have them work on projects in Spain for 8 weeks.
My
And
future
so,
son-in-law is doing research for Spanish, and I thought that would be very beneficial for
well, every 2 years. This summer I'm doing a workshop at the Huntington in California. It's just a 3-week workshop, and people can apply for that. But that's mainly for graduate students. You know, if he's a graduate student, tell him to keep his eyes open for the Mellon Scholarship for Spanish Paleography, and that will run every 2 years. So we'll do the one this summer, and I hope in 2 years we'll do another one at the Huntington. And the Huntington, the scholarship pays for attendees, 15. Yeah, it's nice for them. Okay.
I just wondered if you could show the slide with the site up again so I could finish.
Sure. Happily. Yep. There we go. It's just laflorida.org. And any complaints about how it works or usability, Francisco's in the back. And he handles all the tech challenges. I should say, I tease Francisco, he's worked on this project for 3 years for free. Yes?
Yeah, with those old manuscripts with pieces of paper missing, how did they figure out what was there?
So the question is, what do you do with the pages that are missing and the old ones? There's nothing to be done about that. So when you transcribe them, you have to just put what is in there, and then note that the rest of the page is roto. It's worm-eaten, there's a gap. Sometimes you can guess what the word is, but we won't fill that in. We might say, probably this word. You have to be very careful about saying, it's definitely this, even if you always want to err on the side of caution. Some of them you can't read at all. Some of them are lost for good. But of the 9,000 pages, I would say 95% of them, we can extract information.
How are you preserving the pages that you've been able to look at? How are you preserving them?
Where the originals, you mean?
Yeah.
The originals are in an archive, in the parish archive in St. Augustine, Florida. If you've been to St. Augustine and you've ever seen the mother house of the Sisters of St. Joseph, it's right behind the mother house. And they have a wonderful building. It's climate controlled. It meets all of the standards you would want to have in a professional archive. Of course, what it doesn't account for are hurricanes and flooding. And that's another challenge that I think a lot of folks are going to have to address soon. Yeah. Yes.
If you have any other questions for Michael or his guests, certainly ask them. We're going to break, have some refreshments. You're our future fossils of the